Good afternoon, everyone. This is Elaine Grohman on Earth Wisdom Circles on Empower Radio. And today I have a very special guest, an internationally known scholar by the name of Steven Newcomb. Steven is a co-founder of the Indigenous Law Institute and now the director of it. In 1992, it was co-founded by Burrill Killstraight and Steven Newcomb. And Burrill Killstraight was the traditional headman and ceremonial leader of the Oglala Lakota Nation. Steven is the author of a very important book I think that everyone needs to read, especially in this time of change. And it is called Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. And he is also the co-producer of the documentary, The Doctrine of Discovery, Unmasking the Domination Code. Thank you very much, Steven, for being with me again. You are a returning guest, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to let people understand the challenges that we face and where these challenges come from. So many people just assume that things are the way they are without really having any true history of what set things in motion. So welcome to the show, Steven.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So can you please tell us about the Doctrine of Discovery, what it means, and when it took place, and what you want people to know?
Well, the simple way to explain the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination is by looking at a number of Vatican papal documents from the 15th century. And most people know the story of Columbus. I think that's a universally known story. But they don't really think of the political and religious context for that. And when you get into the details of that history, what you find is that Pope Alexander VI in 1493 issued a number of papal documents that said that the monarchs of Spain and Portugal were to have an understanding between themselves as to what Spain was entitled to and what Portugal was entitled to in terms of world colonization. And when you go into those documents, they connect to earlier documents from the earlier 1400s, such as the Papal Bull Dum Diversus from 1452. And when you look at the specific language, the vocabulary that was used by Pope Nicholas V in that document, what you see is a vocabulary of domination. So, for example, the Pope said that the King of Portugal was authorized to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and to take away all their possessions and property, and to convert the land. Now, convert the land, you could think about that in terms of converting the land into profit, but into all of the riches and wealth that would come from those lands, and also from selling slaves. And so that vocabulary, when you trace that into the later documents in 1493, you see the same patterns of domination. So, for example, in the Papal Bull of May 3rd, 1493, there's a sentence which in Latin reads, "Que sub actuali dominio temporali aliquorum dominorum Christianorum constitute non essent," which means lands that are not established or constituted under the domination of any Christian dominators. That's dominio for domination and dominorum Christianorum, Christian dominators. And then there's another sentence in the May 4th, 1493 papal document, which says, "We trust in him," or have confidence in him, capital H on him, which is referring to a deity, their deity, "from whom empires and dominationes," in Latin, empires and dominations and all good things proceed. So this is a theology of domination that's expressed in those documents. And it has not been well understood that the United States federal Indian law system, but more importantly, the entire global system of states and so forth, are emerging out of those documents. And those are the seeds of domination that were planted all over the world, particularly on this continent and in this hemisphere. And those are the seeds of thought and behavior that produced a reality system of domination that we're still suffering from to this day.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Can you please explain what was the original relationship between the Vatican, the papacy, and monarchs? So, we have this presumption in the United States of the separation of church and state, but we know that that is a fallacy in many ways. So can you explain what that relationship was with Portugal and Spain?
Well, at that time, the Western European world was understood as Christendom, the empire of the Christian world. And you had a spiritual head of that Christian empire, and you had monarchs, various monarchs. And so it gets into a lot of detail and nuance that we could go into, but I think they're not terribly important for this part of the story. But certainly those monarchs believed that once they got the seal of approval from the Pope, that gave them a type of monopoly over those areas of the planet that they were supposedly entitled to because of the approval by the Vicar of Christ. And so this spiritual imprimatur, so to speak, this spiritual seal of approval, it was very, very important. And that had to do with a kind of shared power and a shared revenue stream, because we have to realize that this was all tied into vast amounts of money, gold and silver and slaves and so forth. And so, and then just the ability to exercise power over others, because domination, of course, is being forced to live or compelled to live subject to the will of someone else, or subject to a will external to one's own. And so that's the kind of system they were establishing everywhere. So when they went into these territories of original nations and peoples, they worked to destroy the existing worlds, the languages, cultures, spiritual traditions, everything that was existing there, and to put in its place their system of domination. And so the states, when you look at the various terms such as civilization, state, ascendancy, sovereignty, property, dominion, and empire, those are 7 terms of domination that form the building blocks, the conceptual starting point for the overall system of domination. And of course, the domination leads to dehumanization.
Right.
So people have not really understood that civilization means the forcing of a cultural pattern on a population to which it is foreign. Sovereignty is an unjust form of political domination that limits human freedom. Max Weber, a very important German sociologist, said that the state is a relation of men dominating men. If the state is to exist, the dominated must submit themselves to the authority claimed by the powers that be. Ascendancy is controlling influence, governing power, domination. Property is not the material object itself, but the absolute right of domination exercised or obtained over that material object. So, and then empire is obviously a domination system, and dominion goes to domo in Latin, which means to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, which means to break the spirit of, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. And so when you combine all those conceptual patterns together and the behavioral patterns that go with those concepts and ideas, then what you have is the recipe for an overall structure and system of domination. And then they put positive sounding words on that, like civilization or democracy. And so they say our democracy, but it's not a democracy. It's an established system of domination.
I think that what's so important about what you're saying, Stephen, is that people, we don't think about how our language is so contrived and manipulated. And we
Yeah.
think it means one thing where it actually means something completely different. So we're espousing things that we don't actually understand. And certainly back in the time where the North American continent was taken over and invaded, there was a language barrier, obviously. There was many people who were not able to read, or that they only listened to what somebody in a position of authority said and took that as a belief. And one of the things I talk to so many people about is once you have a belief, you don't have to think, because you're expected to uphold a belief, whether you understand where it comes from or not. And so I think that what's important is for people in the North American continent and Central America and South America to know that the Americas were one, everyone was family. There was no such thing as a quote unquote border. There was the land.
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree with that entirely. People's had their understanding of their traditional territory and where their boundaries were.
Yes.
And I understand the spirit in what you're saying that. For example, my friend Ian Zabarty, the medicine man Corbin Harney, before he passed, he took Ian around and he showed him the markers for their territory, the landmarks, the significant mountain or the significant place, and gave him that sense of this is our Nueva Segovia territory. And now, not sense of territory in the European sense, because that word territory means to hold a place in subjection through terror in the European sense. It's terreo and torium, combining those two ideas of terror and torium. It's a place. And so but yes, your sense of a spiritual relationship with the land and spiritual relationship with others. I'll tell you one thing that's so important, which is there is no example of a religious war ever in the whole among our nations and peoples in what's now called North America, Turtle Island. No religious wars. That's hugely significant when you look at the amount of religious warfare on the European continent, right?
Right, because religious wars are based on ideologies, and I would assume. And there is, there's so much we don't know about history and the projection of a story that has been enforced on our belief systems, on our education systems, that we kind of accepted hook, line, and sinker without really realizing what it actually means. So can you tell us what was the consequence and what was the initiating consequence of this doctrine of discovery? And how has that followed through over this many years, centuries?
Well, obviously the extent to which the continent and the hemisphere has been overrun by all of the peoples that came from elsewhere, but more importantly, the economic and political types of patterns for exploiting resources and taking resources, stealing the resources of the original nations and peoples, and helping themselves to that. But more importantly, setting up a legal and political apparatus that would enable them to exercise power in ways that would be destructive to and annihilating of the original nation. So there's a genocidal intent, that is to the intent to destroy in whole or in part the original nations by taking them apart at the seams to destroy their languages, cultures, and spiritual traditions and their original ways of life, their spiritual ways of life. So the way in which the languages had been evolved over countless generations, thousands and thousands and thousands of years, to use Western European time frame language, those languages were just destroyed or hugely negatively impacted through boarding schools and so forth without regard to what was being destroyed. and the idea systems and the value systems and the spiritual systems that were embedded and evolved in those languages. So, for example, you take the Lakota language, and the sound law is a deep term of endearment or affection. And so you have Pilamia or Wopila, and that law sound, every time you hear that, it's a term of deep affection or endearment. And so that's a way of having a deep affection and endearment for one another and for other forms of life. That's just one term, one little concept, right? But you can take that and multiply that through thousands of examples, many, many thousands of examples of a whole different way of thinking about our relationship to the natural world and our way of responsibility for the natural world.
That's
And
right.
so that's just a tiny little aspect of it.
Well, and I think that in our Western mind,
Yeah.
we have the arrogance of mind that thinks that if we name something, that we know something. And we don't. Just by naming a tree doesn't mean we know the tree. And so I think that what's so beautiful about the indigenous language, it was such a, as you said, such a deep and abiding respect for what contributed to and created our lives. And it wasn't a tool to be used, it was life itself.
Well, yeah, and I think it's important to speak in present tense. There's a kind of a weird way in which past and present tense enter into our discussion.
Correct.
But these are languages that, to a great extent, except for those that were completely destroyed, are still existing, and so those patterns are still here with us, and we have
Yes.
the opportunity to learn from those. But your larger point is very well taken, that these are completely different ways of perceiving reality and entering into a world. And so if you look at a tree as a sacred being, you cannot at the same time simultaneously look at that tree as so many board feet to be converted into monetary gain. And so that's part of the challenge, is that there was a spiritual way of life existing throughout this whole continent, throughout the whole hemisphere, that the invading forces of that Christian European world work to destroy. And I think one of the most important points that I've recently understood how to express is that the Supreme Court of the United States in 1823, through a decision called Johnson versus McIntosh, created the argument that the arrival of the Christian Europeans' mental world of domination is what destroyed the right and ability of our original nations to live a free and independent existence. And so the Supreme Court expressed that in a number of ideas or sentences in that decision, where, for example, it said their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations were necessarily diminished by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave title to those who made it. So their claim of a title of domination, and therefore a right of domination, they claimed that that had destroyed or ended the right of our nations and peoples to live free and independent of their mentality of domination. And Chief Justice Marshall rationalized that on the basis of the religion, what he called the religion of the original nations, because he said the character and religion of its inhabitants, meaning the continent's inhabitants, afforded an apology, or provided a rationale, is what that means, afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. And that word ascendancy means controlling influence, governing power, domination. So the character and religion of the continent's inhabitants afforded a rationale for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim a right of domination, is the translation of that sentence. That's considered to still be an active precedent of the U.S. Supreme Court today as we're having this interview. And the other decisions that have spun off of that or emerged out of that initial decision, such as Tehitan Indians versus the United States in 1955. That decision was cited last month, on the 5th of last month, February 5th, 2021, by the Justice Department of the Biden administration in the Oak Flat case, the Apache case called Oak Flat, their sacred area that's going to be devastated and destroyed by a mining project if this situation goes forward. And the United States government is still citing to this language, that's this decision that goes back to the Vatican Papal Bulls and to this entire notion of domination.
And our people, and again, my guest is Steven Newcomb, and are people aware that there is this tie? People in legislature, people in government, in our United States government, are they aware clearly of this direct influence by the Vatican and this papal bull and other papal bulls, and how it has affected our law?
In 1996, I haven't had an opportunity to interact with a very high official at the State Department. And he was an undersecretary for democracy, human rights, and labor. And he took a pamphlet that I had published way back then, 1992. This was around 1996 that I had this interaction with him. And he took that to the high-ups at the State Department, above his level. So that would be at the very, very highest level of legal affairs at the State Department, and asked them, what about Newcomb's theory? And they said, yeah, it's true. It's true. But that's the foundation, and there's no going back. Now, that might not be a direct quote, but that was the meaning and certainly the information that was conveyed to me by that person at the State Department. And so that was the validation to me that, yeah, at the very highest levels, they do know. Does every single congressperson know this information? No. I had a personal conversation with Justice Scalia back in 2006, I believe it was, and he claimed he'd never heard of the Doctrine of Discovery and never heard of the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, which either he was lying or he was completely ignorant of the legal system that he was operating within. And that was after nearly 20 years or so on the bench, I think. So there is a great level of ignorance. And I'm one of the rare people that ever bothered to go back through these old documents. And I've spent my entire adult life since I was a teenager. I'll be 66 this April, and spent 50 years now since I was a teenager working on this journey and being able to uncover this information.
And I believe, if I'm correct with the date, it was in 2016, you actually met with Pope Francis, or you gave him, I don't know whether it was directly to him or through one of his aides, a copy of your book?
I actually was able to hand him my book and prayed a little bit in our Lenape language and told him that we were calling upon him to formally revoke the Inter Cetera Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493. And it happened to be the 526th year from 523 years from the very day that the document had been issued.
Oh my.
That's
what was his response to that?
He said he would read the book. That was it. I mean, I wouldn't expect more. It was a very quick type of meet and greet interaction. But we had a 2.5-hour meeting with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And we laid the whole case out with regard to the papal bulls. The problem is that the people at the Vatican are also ignorant of their own history. Yes. They don't really know these documents. They never expected us to live, to survive, to be able to speak this language in the way that we do now, and to be able to do a retrospective, to go back through the historical record and the documents and dig as deep as we have to unearth this information. So in a sense, we're sort of like anthropologists of the dominator. This is deep, deep excavation of their concepts and ideas, of their documentation. And, we also went to the archives of the Indies in Seville, Spain, and saw 2 of the original Vatican Papal Bulls at the archives of the Indies in the director's office. And
Wow.
they're written on vellum, parchment, and octopus ink.
Mm.
And so that's indelible, permanent ink, right?
Yes.
And you could get into a lot of metaphorical imagery with regard to the octopus and so forth, and
Many tentacles.
that type of thing, right?
Mhm.
But that was extraordinary because that was 520 years from the date of the May 3rd, 1493 papal document. And so there's an element of this that is it's very spiritually. It's always been a spiritual movement on our part. It's been a spiritual path to be able to try to understand what really has transpired on this planet, but from our perspective, which is from the shore looking out at those ships coming into the shore, not being on the ship coming toward our own ancestors. And then the other part of I wanted to mention in my book, Pagans in the Promised Land, we have to account for the Old Testament narrative of the chosen people in the Promised Land, because that was used very much against our nations and peoples here. And the term the New Israel was used. And this idea that when they go to the lands of the Canaanites, Moabites, Hittites, Amorites, and so forth, that they were to take those lands. And when you go to Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 18 in the Old Testament, it says that the chosen people are to save alive nothing that breathes, as the Lord thy God has commanded you. And it's in Psalms 2, verse 8, it says, ask of me, and I shall give to you the heathen for your inheritance, which is a form of property, which we already talked about, being a right of absolute right of domination, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. So those are 2 examples of this kind of theological, what I call a theology of domination, that has to be taken into consideration. And when people talk about interfaith dialogue or interreligious dialogue, they're not talking about these types of very dark aspects of the theological record that go along with the dark aspects of the papal record in terms of the papal documents that we've been talking about.
Right, because the very word religion means to regulate, to control. And again,
And to bind.
And to bind. And so many people are just so unaware. And as the title of your book, Pagans, most people are, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but, having been Irish ancestry and going to Ireland and seeing the quote unquote pagan sites, most people don't know that the pagan did not have a nasty connotation like it has now.
Mm-hmm.
It was really those who honored the earth, those who honored life.
Yeah.
Not those who were the bad guys, not those who were devil worshippers and all kinds of crazy notions that people have. That our language is so manipulated because so many people were uneducated, or their language itself was controlled by kingdoms. And dialects were created so the moment somebody opened their mouth, someone would know where they were from. And they could be killed on the spot. So, the emissaries of a kingdom were the only ones who could travel the roads back and forth, and they were heavily guarded in Europe. So this subjugation is not United States or North American continent, certainly is not the first place dominated. It was, They did the same thing in Europe, everywhere.
Yeah, and the other part of it is that the term pagan comes from paganus, meaning people that live in the country. Mm-hmm. So it's the country dwellers, or the savage or sauvage from French, the forest dwellers, the people that live in the forest. The Moors are the people that live in the marshland. So there are these terms that have been turned into a type of slur against an enemy or infidel, not of the faith, right? So they take these people and they create a sense of the connotation that they're enemies of the faith, and then therefore it's open season on them. Mm-hmm. And you can go after them and destroy them. And so but the fact that those kinds of ideas have been institutionalized in law and policy in the United States, and then buried at a deep level, and yet they can still be using them as of last month, and nobody says anything about it. Even though the legal brief in the 1954 legal brief of the U.S. government leading up to the Teton decision the following year specified a papal document from 1344 and 1954 and papal bulls from 1493, and citing to Genesis 128 and the Book of Psalms in the U.S. government's legal brief submitted to the Supreme Court, and said that the Teton people should not be given monetary compensation for a taking of their timber because the Christian nations of Europe had acquired jurisdiction over the lands of heathens and infidels.
Oh my God.
That's all in that legal brief. And then the Supreme Court upheld that in 1955. And in February 5th of this past month, the U.S. government is still citing to that reasoning process as to why the Apache people should not have any right to prevent the complete annihilation of their spiritual site. So that takes the Old Testament narrative of the chosen people in the promised land, the Vatican Papal Bulls, the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, all of the reasoning process and the legal brief in 1954, and launches that as a weapon system against the Apache people, saying you have no right to have your own spiritual way of life and your sacred site because our monetary gain for this mining company, the Rio Tinto mining company and other mining companies, are more important than your so-called spiritual connection to your land.
Oh, Stephen,
And why is that not being discussed in the society? Why is that? Why there's no federal Indian law attorneys talking about this? Nobody's
talking.
Not?
And why are not Native American? Why are not Indigenous people in there? Why are you the only one speaking? So,
well, I'm not the only one.
Well, you're a figurehead. You're a figurehead.
My friend Peter Dorico and my friend Joe Day Gowdy and my daughter Shauna Blue Star Newcomb, and yes. Some of us are talking about this, but certainly just a tiny, and the Haudenosaunee, the Onondaga Nation, there are some people talking about it, but I think I'm the one that's talking about it most specifically in these terms.
Right.
With to have this specific documentation that I can rattle off the top of my head, that's a little different.
Yes, it is.
Than most people. And so I've prepared myself for this opportunity to be able to say these things over a very long period of time. There's a lot of hard work in terms of the excavation of the information, the reading of the documents and the books and so forth, and being able to craft and express your argumentation.
Yes.
To be able to express your ideas. So it's not suddenly that somebody just decides they're going to do this and then they can simply do it immediately. So if people didn't ever prepare themselves to be able to express these ideas because they were just simply looking at standard federal Indian law and the standard approach to that field, talking about the plenary power of Congress and the trust relationship and all these things that most federal Indian law attorneys talk about, then there's no seeming to be no desire to go deeper to say, hey, wait a minute, how did that whole system get started? And why are we treating those, I'm using we very loosely there, but why are these papal bulls and royal charters of England and other such documents treated as if they had any validity whatsoever? Because as far as I'm concerned, they had no validity. They were void when initiated. You can't launch your jurisdiction thousands of miles across an ocean and have it be legitimate and valid. And when you come to the territorial waters of a coastal nation, that suddenly you as a foreigner invading suddenly have jurisdiction and a right of domination over these peoples already living there. But then our ancestors at that time didn't have an ability to speak the invader's language or to even understand that language.
Yes.
So how many centuries does it take to be able to gain and acquire fluency and efficiency in that language, to be able to understand the historical record, to know what the elite of the elite of the elite were planning and perpetrating so that we can respond to that. That's why it's taken centuries to get to this point.
Well,
Is that effort to be able to engage in that excavation of information.
Yes, I thank you personally for what you've done, because just the amount of scholarly information that you've been able to read through and weed through and make the connections is incredible, because it's something that everyone in the world needs to know. If we're really going to change as human beings, we have to be accountable for what has happened, and not to, we can't undo anything that was done in the 1400s in terms of that person that wrote it, but we can say no more. We have to look at what it is, honestly. And I think
and where are the domination free zones? Are there any?
No. And of course,
you would look at murdered and missing indigenous women, and you look at the treatment, the abuse and domination, the dehumanization of women across the planet.
That was my next point.
Destruction of ecological systems. They all emerge out of the idea systems and behavioral systems that I'm talking about.
Exactly.
And so this, as you're saying, this is something that's critically important to the whole planet.
Yes. And because of that, in fact, I interviewed Grandmother Mary Lyons, who's very much involved with the murdered and missing women, and others, that there's, as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, to see that this has been so normalized and that sociopathic behavior is normalized. And we have to understand why. And how do we look at it honestly? And I want to thank you personally again, because you're looking at it honestly and saying what is real. And it's very important. Stephen, could you please tell people how they can find your book? Where's the best place to get your book? And also to look at your documentary, your movie.
Yeah, we have a Vimeo. So the movie can be obtained through Sheldon Wolfchild at 38plus2productions.com, or through our Vimeo. You can find that at originalfreenations.com. And also the book Pagans in the Promised Land can be obtained through Amazon. And that's probably the easiest way to do that. It's now been picked up by Chicago Review Press, and so it's a different publisher, but so it's still available. I think it's going through its third, perhaps fourth printing. So it's done pretty well over the years, but it just, I'm working on my newest book, and
Tell us about that, please.
Well, it's basically going deeper into everything that I've been mentioning in this interview, in terms of that vocabulary, a domination translator. How do you realize that you're actually looking at patterns of domination? The funny thing about that, or strange thing about it, is how do you become conscious of domination?
Yes.
So the way you do that is through the use of that word. But then there aren't that many other words that actually are that make it come into consciousness. So it ends up being kind of difficult, because the number of words that can be used to really describe it are very limited. So then you end up repeating that same word over and over again, and then it becomes kind of deadening, because people, oh my God, not again. And as a writer, you're taught to not repeat yourself. Once you've said something, move on. But when you realize that there's an underlying system, and you're able to identify that system, and then use a translator, for example, the way I did that with the sentence from Johnson versus McIntosh, to identify ascendancy as the key word of domination in there, then I re-express the sentence using the word domination instead of ascendancy. That makes what's in the background come into the foreground, and be very evident, very, very evident to people. So that's a big part of the book.
Yeah, and there's that phrase that many people maybe have heard but not understood, and it is, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, which means that everything is a coded language.
Yeah.
that, or there's evidence that if you see a particular thing, that's a signal to those who understand what it is they're looking at. So your dedication to decoding these words, decoding these symbols that we think of as our part of our language without realizing it's a contrived language as a code, as you use the term decoding so appropriately, is, what is a code? We think of our genetic code, for instance. It's something that we twist words into thinking, well, this is just how we are. And so to decode that means to say, no, this is how you've been created. This is how your mind has been infiltrated with thoughts that are not healthy and real and life affirming.
Right. Yeah.
And that's,
so how much more time do we have? Or do we have a couple more minutes? Or
yeah, we do.
Out of time?
We have about 10 more minutes.
Good.
No, about 16 more minutes.
I want to mention one other thing that is a very important part of the trail.
Please.
And that has to do with Joseph Story, who was seated on the Supreme Court at the time of the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling in 1823. 10 years later, he published a book called Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. And in the opening of that book, he's examining the English claim of title to lands in North America. And he paraphrases at the opening of the book the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, which he was part of deciding. Okay, and it was written primarily by his best friend and mentor, Chief Justice John Marshall. So he's paraphrasing that Johnson versus McIntosh ruling at the opening of the book, and then he comes to a point where he's discussing the Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493, and he has a couple of footnotes. And one of those footnotes quotes Latin language from the May 4th Papal Bull, and that Latin language in part says "Ac barbarae nationes deprimantur," which means "and barbarous nations be reduced or subjugated." And then at the end of that section, he comes to the new section, section 6, and that section begins by stating this: "This principle then," the word "then" is referring back to the Papal Bull that he's just mentioned and quoted from, "that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority the discovery was made against all of the European governments." Now, those 22 words, "that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all of the European governments," are verbatim from the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. But Story did not put any quotation marks on them. And he didn't cite any footnote, have a footnote there to indicate that they came from the Johnson ruling. So what happened was that I had obsessed over the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling for years and years and years. I read it over and over and over, and I dissected and tore it apart and did research on all the various parts and so forth over the course of a decade. And I also was obsessed over that particular section of the Story book. And one day I had one sheet of paper, and there were 2 pages from the book copied on that sheet of paper. And I was making a phone call, and I tossed that sheet of paper down on the table, and I was waiting for the phone, to see if anybody picked up on the other line. And I was just glancing at the page, and suddenly my brain locked into those words, and I recognized that those were the same words that are found in the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. And I realized at that moment that he had made this direct connection between the Papal Bull and the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling. And I hadn't noticed that in all the years I had been reading that sheet of paper.
Wow.
I'd never noticed that. But suddenly the light came on, and that you could see very clearly what that was all about. And so I wanted to mention that because that makes it ironclad. It's irrefutable at that point when a man who was on the Supreme Court at the time of the Johnson ruling puts that in his book 10 years later. and makes that direct connection, and he's still on the Supreme Court when he publishes the book, how can you say that that's not true? Unless you can make that disappear,
Right.
then it is true. It is
That's
true.
right.
And he's the one that documented that.
So, Stephen, what do you think is the next step? What would be the best, in a perfect world, if everyone was fully open and there was open disclosure, what would be the best way to begin to dismantle all of this horrible history?
Well, it's always kind of funny to talk about dismantling ideas, because people talk about dismantling a system. But if it's a system of domination that's perpetuated and maintained through a vocabulary of domination, and when the language that everyone speaks is actually that language of domination, the English language, more than 60% of English is actually derived directly from the Latin language of the Roman Empire.
Right.
And so that is a big part of the problem, that the neurological system that we're operating on the basis of in our brains and the functioning and of the language and so forth, we're interwoven into this whole pattern that we now say we want to disassemble or disestablish or deconstruct or whatever, yet we maintain it at the same time that we say we want to undo it.
Right. So perhaps a better way to say it is, how do we create something better?
There you go. Exactly. So to me, what I've been talking about is domination-free zones, just as a concept, to say, how do you create a domination-free zone in a world of domination? The first thing you have to do is become aware of the fact that it's a domination system.
Correct.
If the euphemisms that are being used constantly hide and cover the fact that it is a system of domination, then that's a big problem right there, because you have not diagnosed properly what it is you're dealing with. If you have gangrene in your leg, which is a blood infection, you sure as heck better deal with that and diagnose it properly, right?
Yes, and not think it's only in your foot.
Exactly.
It's your blood.
Yeah. So then that's part of the problem. What is the actual correct diagnosis?
Yes.
And so it's very easy for people to talk about racism, white supremacy, a lot of things that are very important to talk about. But what they don't seem to understand, that those are consequences and results of a deeper system of domination that's at the root.
That's right. And that's why I think that what you're saying is it literally should be heard by everyone, because, and I recognize that I am ignorant. And, there's a difference even in the language. I was just writing about this. There's a difference between not knowing and willfully ignoring. And I don't want to willfully ignore. I want to educate myself.
Yeah.
And that's the whole purpose of Earth Wisdom Circles, is to educate people in a circular way about the earth with wisdom, because ultimately we think that the accumulation of knowledge is of value, but if the knowledge is just words that mean nothing, then you're just espousing madness. And if you don't know how to glean the wisdom and the clarity from what is real, then we can't move forward, because it's just a repeating pattern.
Right. And so I think that's why I think that Shauna's work is so important, because my daughter Shauna, because she has this very youthful, bright, radiant positivity about her. I'm more the curmudgeon, negative guy. We have this conversation.
No, not negative, just
the
have
glass
a different clarity about it.
The glass half empty or half full. And I said, well, it's not an either or.
Right.
A glass half empty is also a glass half full. Right. And so we have to look at that balance to realize we have to look at that dark side and the shadow, as well as the positivity and what we're trying to achieve. Because what people don't care for conflict. They don't like conflict. People want to go immediately to the solution, but not realizing that. Let me give you an example. Reconciliation. It's a big buzzword now. It's all the rage, right? Oh, reconciliation, truth and reconciliation. up in Canada, for example,
Right.
which is a big lie. Okay. It's a truth and lie commission because there was never a beneficial relationship that fell apart that needs to be put back together.
Right.
So what's being reconciled as an
Nothing.
example? Okay.
Okay.
And so these ways in which the language serves as an impediment to what we need to accomplish is a real key part of the overall situation. And so anyway, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that your second book is going to be looking at the real meanings, because again, we don't even realize in our ignorance and then our laziness, because you're right, people don't like conflict, but they don't realize they're in conflict constantly.
Right.
They're in conflict in their minds, they're in conflict as, they don't understand where they stand.
Exactly. And where I was going with that other thought is that people want to immediately move to this positivity, but the domination system is still ongoing. It's not as if it ended. And then we can, oh, thank goodness that's ended. Now we can come together in this positive way. Yeah, okay, we want to come together in this positive way, but we also have to look at this shadow side to realize that's still ongoing.
Yes.
And what are we going to do about that? Because until we deal with that, how in the world can we talk about coming together in this positive way as if that is somehow solved?
Right.
You get what I'm saying?
I do, because there is this concept of positive and negative, but in order for there to be a movement forward, like an electrical current, you have to have a neutrality. You have to have a neutral point where that current moves from positive to neutral, to negative to neutral to positive. So it's neutrality does not mean you don't know or you're ignorant. It means you're willing to look at it all with clarity.
Right.
And I think that that's where we have to begin to, first of all, know that we don't know. And when you know that you don't know, then you open a lot of doors of possibilities. Instead of just fighting for what you think you know.
Well, the other part of that also is, a lot of times you can not necessarily agree on what you're all in favor of, but perhaps if we can all agree that we're opposed to domination, to the domination and dehumanization, that becomes the commonality that we all share, and come together as allies on that basis to figure out how we're going to end the domination and make that the movement to end the domination system. That could be a very beautiful thing, because at the same time we're building the alternative models, the models of positivity, of the appreciation and renewal of life, the working with the life-giving processes of life.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And
in a way that creates a different type of outcome in the long run.
And I want to thank you for also mentioning your daughter, Shauna, because I will be having her on next week's show. And I think that that's really important, to have this wonderful, youthful joy of life, and looking at how to change this. How do we look forward into, look backward to see what happened. You have to see what happened. You can't ignore what happened. And you stand in the place of the present so that you can help to create a future that is our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and ourselves might be born back into.
Yeah. The other thing I want to mention was redthought.org, which is my friend Joe DeGaudy, redthought.org, Joe DeGaudy, and he's a former chairman of the Yakima Nation, and we have about 15 hours of content on there so far with regard to conversations between my friend Peter Dorico, who taught legal studies at UMass Amherst for 30 years and has a Yale law degree as an attorney. He and I have been having a 30-year conversation about these issues. He's working on getting his book published. It's going to be extraordinary. And the content on redthought.org is just fabulous for anybody that wants to get a real understanding of the nuance and the detail and so forth. I highly recommend that site. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll look into that. And what is the last things that you would like people to know? We have a few more minutes left, but tell us some of your thoughts. And I hope to have you back on the show again, Stephen, if you're interested in, especially after your new book comes out, because I think that part of a kindness of humanity is to educate one another in the most genuine way, the most loving way, the most inclusive way. Because the only thing that we have in common really is this life.
Right. Well, I think that's correct. And people have a tendency, for the most part, I think, to want positivity. I say that, with mentally having a real caveat about that, because there's so much destruction on the planet. But at the same time, there is some real difficulty with the way in which a lot of these concepts that we habitually use are misunderstood. So I'll give you an example, since you used the word human. In 1930, there was a California Supreme Court decision in a case called City of San Diego versus Cuyamaca Water District, or Water Company, maybe it was. And in the midst of that decision, the Supreme Court of California said the only thing existing in California prior to the Spanish arrival was a state of barbarism. A state of barbarism, meaning the native peoples were living in a state of barbarism, which means a non-human existence. So then if you think about that, how could they become human? Only by being baptized and being forced to build their own prison in the form of a mission, the Spanish Catholic mission, and forced to labor and toil for the Spanish soldiers and the priests. And then once they're under that system of domination that's established there, then they're considered to be human. But because they're being subjected to all kinds of abuse and suffering, then eventually one day they're said to have human rights, which is supposed to give them some relief from that suffering. But then we're told that human rights are only an aspiration, that, they might be fundamental human rights, but they're an aspiration, something to aspire to have one day, just like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They say that's an aspirational document. You aspire to one day have those things. But the word indigenous means dominated. So it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Dominated Peoples, but they don't say lift the domination off of them and liberate them from the domination, just give them rights under the domination system that they're living under. So there are these unusual aspects and ways that we're able to, if we spend the time at it, able to dig deep into all these concepts and realize the language that we think we're speaking has all these weird nuances and limitations that trip us up every time.
Right. It's so convoluted. We just don't even realize it.
Yeah.
That we're always speaking against ourselves. We're not speaking for life. We're speaking against ourselves, either as a male or a female, or as a culture or heritage or ethnicity or where you live, or it's just crazy.
Yeah.
It's made us in a way sociopathic, meaning sick in our social thinking. We don't have social thinking. Sociopathic by nature means a sick mind.
Yeah. Well, and there's the ecological aspect as well, because the killing of ecological systems is ultimately, if it's done on a large enough scale, is a kind of collective suicide pact, right?
Yes, of course.
So you look, one of my friends was going to meet with federal government officials about the environment. And so I said, well, I have a question you can ask them. And he said, yeah, what's that? And I said, ask them to name any ecological system that's better off today than before they touched it.
Doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't. So what does that say? But I think part of the challenge, but also part of the reward of this work, is to be able to think of these types of subtleties and be able to express language in a way that gives us greater insight into our predicament.
Right.
And then the question becomes, what are we going to do about it?
Right.
And
Well, I want to thank you for your time today, Stephen. And again, my guest is Steven Newcomb. Stephen, what is the best place for people to reach out to you?
well, I think originalfreenations.com, that's our website at the
Thank
moment.
you.
And there's contact information there and a link to our documentary movie. And I thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. And I would look forward to having you back again, especially after your second book comes out, and we can talk about that because you have a lot to say and we have a lot to learn.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Wanishi.
Wanishi.